phrase, "fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me," springs to mind. Let's go back to the ancient year of 1992. After spending a decade being praised as the lost holy grail of Doctor Who, the undisputed greatest story of all time, a perfect lost classic, The Tomb of the Cybermen is unexpectedly and unbelievably returned to the BBC. All 4 episodes, in excellent condition, having apparently been down the back of a sofa at Hong Kong's TV station for 20-odd years. This apparently unbelievable discovery was quickly released on VHS for the entire of Doctor Who fandom to discover that Tomb was a really great story. Fantastically paced, smartly written, with the Cybermen at their menacing best, and Patrick Troughton shining in one of his greatest performances. It was a fantastic story. What it wasn't was an absolutely flawless, perfect gem that was the greatest story of all time. It was great, but it was pretty ropey in places, had more than a few holes in the plot, and Toberman as a character, while you can dispute whether he was outright racist, it was certainly going to result in a new or two. It was great, but it wasn't perfect, and this was contrary to the expectation that fans had built up of it, and so it's ended up with a reputation in some circles of being a bit of a disappointment. Which I think is mostly unfair, but with the lofty ambitions that have been set for it pre-Discovery, it seems that outcome was inevitable. Now, obviously, I'm not reviewing Tomb today, I'm reviewing The Web of Fear, and see if you can see where I'm going with this. In the 2000s, with the recovery of Tomb now firmly in the rearview mirror, and the realisation it was great but not perfect firmly set in, it was time for fandom to set their sights on a new missing Troughton story to lionise, and that became The Web of Fear. I was only a young'un in the late 2000s, but reading the Doctor Who magazines at the time, you'd think this story was Doctor Who's cross between Citizen Kane and The Godfather. In fact, I remember distinctly watching a DVD documentary of the time, and an eminent writer who shall go unnamed, but he wrote Dalek and his name rhymes with Dob Cheerman, said he was literally emotional that he couldn't keep watching past episode 1, the only one that existed at the time. And, come on man, you're a grown man, really? Unfortunately, it seemed that fandom had fallen for exactly the same wheeze again, so when, incredibly, history repeated itself in 2013, and most of The Web of Fear was returned to the BBC archives, it turned out, again, what we had in our hands was a great story, a tense, atmospheric, really well-crafted mystery with excellent characters, but it was not the perfect holy grail of Doctor Who, and was not, in fact, flawless. Fool me once, etc., and so forth. I love The Web of Fear. It really is just atmospheric Doctor Who at its finest, a fine whodunit and makes brilliant use of all its elements, and its characters are so effective that one of them would have become undoubtedly the series' most enduring supporting character, whose legacy reverberates in New Who right up to the present day. And apart from anything else, it's a Doctor Who story set in the London Underground, which is basically combining my twin passions. If this story had existed when I was a child, I think I might have exploded. It's an excellent story and 60s Who doing what it does best, but it's not flawless. There's one point where it kind of grinds to a halt, and some of the plot points are more than a bit dubious. I'm happy to accept and look past those flaws, but they do exist, and oh look, fandom fell for it again. And we're in the old place where twice we've had the holy grail of Missing Who returned, and twice we've realised you can't properly judge something you can't see. And who knows, maybe if the power of the Daleks ever gets found, I'll be the one with my clown makeup on having fallen for exactly the same wheeze, but I think, though, one of the reasons I do like this story so much is that in 2013 I was approaching it with fresh eyes. I mean, I'd seen episode 1, of course, it was and is an exceptional opening episode, but as I said when I discussed the Master Plan Returns the other month, I'd never sat down and watched the reconstructions, I only had a passing knowledge of what actually happened in the rest of the story, mostly that the Brigadier was in it without being the Brigadier yet. For me, watching that DVD for the first time, it was like experiencing a whole new story, without expectations to weigh me down, and I was able to see the story for what it was. So all I want to know, my Frazer story is based on that, and not viewing it for a mythical something that it isn't actually. Of course, another thing that hurt Webb in all that is that it was recovered at the same time as a mostly forgotten story that actually turned out to be really good. Now, as much as I think of The Enemy of the World is an excellent story, this one is certainly better, there's no question in my mind about that, but when you find the Holy Grail and a coffee mug, and the Holy Grail is actually just pretty great, and the coffee mug massively exceeds expectations, attention is naturally going to gravitate to this amazing coffee mug. So I think certainly adds to the perception there, but you all surely know how easy it is for internet perceptions to take over. So I suppose we'll start looking at the story itself, starting with its archive status. Webb was sold to 7 countries, Australia and New Zealand having a set each, Gibraltar probably sending its set to Zambia, while Hong Kong sent its prints to Singapore, and then they went on to Nigeria. All in all, it's pretty average for a Troughton story. The Aussie and Kiwi prints were either sent back to the BBC or junked, while we know, there's nothing BBC left in Zambia, so they must have shared the same fate. The fate of the eventual Nigerian prince was for many years unknown. Episode 1 was found at a stack of cans at the BBC in 1978, which made it technically the first missing episode to be recovered once the Film Library and Enterprises had been catalogued, which initially was thought to come from the Hong Kong-Singapore set, but for reasons that will become obvious in a moment, it is now thought to probably have been the Australian print, being part of the 1975 set of returns from which many Orphan episodes probably originated from. For 35 years that was it, until it turned out that a set that went from the Far East to Nigeria was still in fact sitting in a Nigerian television station, and all 6 episodes were triumphantly returned to the BBC. Okay, not quite. It's likely we'll never know what really happened, because, well, Phil Morris is no longer the lionised hero of all Doctor Who he was in 2013, and not just because he spent that time whinging about the wokes, although it hasn't helped, but because the circumstances of the recovery, or to be precise how Episode 3 managed to disappear, has become more and more head-scratching over time, with all the contradictory information he's put out. His story is that he found all 12 prints, the 6 episodes of this story and Enemy, in the TV station in Nigeria, but between their discovery and his going to collect them, Episode 3 of the story had vanished. The question everyone asked was how anyone found out, of course, and the probable answer is that he couldn't keep his mouth shut about it, so this mysterious private collector got wind of it, but this led to even more unanswered questions, and even more reasons why Morris seems to have botched this. He did release a photo supposedly of the 12 prints in a TV station, but frankly at this point I'm willing to accept it's a photo of 12 blue film cans and nothing else about it. In fact, given all the conflicting nonsense we've heard from Morris, the only thing I'm willing to accept is that 11 films were returned to the BBC. Where they came from, how he found them, how he dealt with them, who knows, and it's unlikely we ever really will. As for Episode 3, well, it remains a hole in the story, and hopefully we do see it again one day, but who knows. How much of a hole does Episode 3 leave in the story? Well, it is a loss, particularly as the story's pacing means much of the setup is a bit of a slow burn, so suddenly losing the pictures for the episode when things start to pick up a bit and does kill the momentum a bit. You do have 2 major options for Episode 3, a telesnap reconstruction, either the loose cannon recon or the official BBC one, which is on the original DVD and might be on the special edition too, but I don't know, and here's why. Or the animation, the infamously terrible 3D animation that looks like it comes out of a Nintendo 64 game, and surprisingly I didn't bother buying a special edition just for that. Now, I've said before it's difficult to blame the people who made them for any issue of the animations, because they have just no budget to do the work. I'm sure if Walt Disney only had about a tenner to work on his movies, it would look terrible too, but there's no one denying how abysmal this looks, and the janky movement gives the whole thing a bit of an uncanny valley vibe, and frankly makes it a bit difficult to watch. I always use my DVDs anyway, but the versions on iPlayer forcing you to watch this just feels a bit wrong. Say we're all about telesnap recons, but at least you're seeing real pictures of real people and not this. So, no, it's not good at all. Just stick with a telesnap recon. So finally, this is bringing us onto the story itself, and first the production. This story was directed by Douglas Camfield, one of the series' most well-known directors, and someone who always did very well with stories with a big scope. He directed 2 of the 3 longest stories of the 60s, The Daleks' Master Plan and The Invasion, both of which were stories of huge reach and scope. The story doesn't necessarily fit that particular bill, being far more closely contained, but through the themes and plot, the idea that this is an occasion definitely does fit his wheelhouse. I think he does an amazing job with this story, personally. Camfield really knew how to make his work fit the emphasis of the piece, and he frames everything brilliantly. The famous scene in Episode 1 of the Yeti in the museum is one of the best directed scenes in the show's history, just oozing atmosphere and keeps it tight and focused on what it needs to be. The interactions, the arguing, the growing tension of the conflict, and the revelations that come from it, all while the inert Yeti sits there, the music building, until suddenly it isn't inert anymore. Every moment perfectly paced and set, with the tension growing at that perfect pace. No doubt kids watching this on first broadcast had that growing pit in their stomach as the Yeti got closer and closer to the activation. It really is just an incredible scene, and this is almost entirely Camfield, as on paper it really is just dry exposition disguised as conflict and then a monster scene. It's Camfield who really brings it to life and makes it as atmospheric and creepy as it is. Admittedly, I could have done without the quite brazen Jewish stereotype, so marks down for that, but on the other hand the script gives the name Julius Silverstein, so only half the blame there. As for the rest of the story, I think it's Camfield's skill that makes this work. All the clambering about in tube tunnels with a lesser director would have ended up as tedious to the extreme, but Camfield always manages to add something more to every scene. Now, the script helps him most of the time by cleverly and eerily always making sure there's something else happening, whether it's just a discussion, an element of tension, or a plot point. But Camfield takes this extra step by making sure the topic of interest stays in the forefront, with the clambering in the background. But never entirely gone, the unique setting is always shown and used for all it's worth, to emphasise the isolated position our heroes find themselves in down in the tunnels. Camfield does a great job shooting the Yeti as well, emphasising their stature, strength and pure power to make them seem as menacing as you would expect the giant teddy bear to be. I mean, I won't go on anymore, but take my word for it, pretty much everything he does is excellent. As for the rest of the production, first we'll talk about the set design. There's the old story that goes around that the production team asked London Transport for permission to film, which they refused. So they built sets so brilliantly accurate that London Transport angrily wrote demanding to know why they'd filmed without permission. I doubt the accuracy of this, because while these sets are excellent, the trained eye can tell they're not the real thing. The tunnels are missing the bits of paraphernalia that would identify them as real. The track in particular doesn't really look real if you know what you're looking for. While the one station set they use, changing the signs every time they want a location change, is far too small to be a real platform, and it's kind of absurd how little it looks like the real thing for some of the stations. I mean, it's completely the wrong shape to be Monument, which is a district line, a cut and cover line, not a tube line. Oh, and also, these scenes are clearly filmed on videotape, not film, which should have been their first clue, it's not a location shoot. So I doubt the truth of this story accepted by most as gospel, but that shouldn't take away how excellent the set design is, because you do have to be a sado like me to recognise any of that, and in capturing the essence of a tube tunnel and tube station, it does it flawlessly. Again, unless you're like me, you'd have no idea it's not accurate to the real thing. It really does look that good, plus of course it helps add to the atmosphere of the piece by emphasising the tight, isolated, constrained feeling. So all in all, despite my debunking of the popular story, it is very impressive. Finally, there's the music. This story doesn't have any original music, not least because of Douglas Camfield's famous feud with Dudley Simpson, so it's just stock library music, but the choices are very good, not least in the museum scene I mentioned earlier where it really, really fits, so the research guys did really well. Which brings us to the script, once again written by Mervyn, Haisman and Henry Da Vinci Code Lincoln. That they should have been brought back to write a sequel so soon is one of the odder things about this story. Remember, this is 2 stories down the line from The Abominable Snowmen. Now, admittedly, there is a gap between the Ice Warriors and the Enemy of the World. Further adventures could have happened, so this isn't necessarily the week or so at most for the TARDIS crew, as would appear to be the case on TV, but even so, 2 stories. Imagine if the Weeping Angels had appeared in Blink, then we'd have the finale with the Master, and then the Weeping Angels were the villain again for the Christmas episode. It's not that nuts they appeared so soon, but I think it does go to show how the Yeti captured the imagination as monsters. And I think it's definitely possible if Haisman and Lincoln hadn't been involved with the clusterfuck that was the Dominators later on, it's possible they would have been brought back a few more times, perhaps having a Pertwee appearance or two like the Ice Warriors got. It's therefore funny that Webb is so very different from Snowmen in so many of his aspects. Separating the Yeti from their natural environment seems to be an odd choice, but a natural one I'd argue. After all, there wasn't much more you could do with that Himalayan setting, and it's a good thing to stretch your story beyond what you think it would fit. After all, who'd have thought putting the Daleks on Earth would be the natural route to take? So I think this was a good move. Developing the series' move towards conventional Earth stories was also a good way of approaching it, by making the threat feel more real to the viewer, and giving more of a sense of place. So all in all, I think the setup for the story was absolutely the right move in all cases. Where things do fall apart a bit is the plotting, and this is where I'll go for my own real criticisms of the story. It's just, like the previous Yeti story, the plot is a bit weak and doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Once again, is the Great Intelligence's plan that's extremely suspect. His ultimate aim is the Doctor and to absorb his massive knowledge base, which is fair enough, although what it's going to do with all that knowledge once it has it is a bit beyond me, but its means of going about it is a bit backwards. Its great plan is to invade London using its mysterious fog to drive its evacuation, force the remaining military presence into the underground as the only safe place, and use the fungus to further close in and destroy them, which is a great invasion plan, but you don't want to invade, you want to find the Doctor. How do these two things come together? Especially given it demonstrates its ability to ensnare the TARDIS, and the Doctor can't control the TARDIS at this point anyway. It's not as if it needed some lure to bring him in. And in fact, all it ends up is giving him the assistance of the military and the Travers, both elder and younger, which is kind of important in allowing him to defeat the Intelligence again. Now, this may sound a bit like nitpicking, and I guess it is to an extent, but it means the entire plot is kind of based on a really flimsy base. It means the Intelligence's pursuit of the Doctor doesn't quite have enough weight to it, and the invasion doesn't feel as important as it necessarily should because it becomes a sideshow very quickly. It also doesn't help there may be just one too many plot conveniences that seem quite lazy, the most egregious being the Doctor apparently switching the wires around being enough to completely reverse the function of the helmet that's going to, suck his brains out. It seems like a bit of a design flaw the Intelligence should have rectified. If I switch the wires around on an Xbox controller, I don't want the game to start controlling me. So, again, that's a bit of an egregious bit of lazy plotting. But in the end, these are minor things. It's not the only minor head-scratcher, but if the overall story is solid, then I'm willing to accept these minor things. Overall, the plot does work quite well, because in a way, it's just the background to the story. And being quite simple, it leaves the important things, mystery, atmosphere, tension and character, to take the centre stage. In fact, my only other real issue with the story is that episode 2 feels a bit weaker than the rest, for reasons they couldn't really help. In the 60s, the production schedule was more or less year-round, so the principal actors had to have breaks for holidays, and thus they'd disappear for an episode or two every now and again. This meant that John Pertwee was in fact the first actor to play the Doctor who appeared in all his episodes. Episode 2 of the story coincided with Patrick Troughton's holiday, and so the Doctor is not appearing in this film for this episode, which results in the whole episode being everyone saying, "Oh, I wonder where the Doctor has got to. If only I could speak to the Doctor, what would the Doctor think?" Which gets a little bit tiring after a while, as the Doctor is kind of needed to get the plot going again. So it's basically just sort of waiting for the episode to end so everything can start actually moving along. Now, to be fair, good use is made of Jamie to drive the plot forward, but poor old Victoria is turned into the exposition fairy and grinds most of what's happening in HQ to a halt, so that's my only other criticism, but that was an occupational hazard of the 60s too. So for the stuff I do like though, let's look at the mystery. The web of fear is essentially a big whodunit, which seems odd for a monster-heavy story like this, but unlike something like The Unicorn and the Wasp, which heavily leans into the tropes, the web of fear's whodunit is far less conventional and feels very natural as a result. It's of course a slow burn to get there, not until episode 4 does it really become the driving force of the story, but that's fine because there's a lot to set up and establish, and the plot beats the first 3 episodes are effective on their own. The mystery is about who's working for the intelligence, with the evidence piling up that there's someone, but never much of a clue about who, and this leaves the audience in the dark just as much as the characters. I mean, yeah, we know it's not going to be any of the regulars, and the story is structured so it'd be pretty impossible to be Anne, or to be honest, even her father, but otherwise the field is wide open, and the story takes excellent advantage of this by zigzagging back and forth between some possibilities, while leaving others on the table. The soon-to-be Brigadier in future stories, and it seems a bit odd to call him the Colonel, that means I'm talking about Graham Chapman's character from Monty Python's Flying Circus, but anyway, we'll just call him the Brigadier for simplicity. The Brigadier, for instance, is one of the biggest red herrings throughout, his sudden appearance and unverifiable story making his arrival suspect, and his acceptance that the Doctor could be a character-informing exercise, or bait to lure the Doctor away, we're not sure. And then of course he fights the Yeti and is the only one to escape, with the model that caused everything to go wrong in his pocket, and his surprise at discovering it seems genuine. But again, you can't be quite sure, especially when he says to Jamie, one of us has to be the traitor, and obviously we the audience know it's not going to be Jamie, so that kind of adds to the suspicion there. And yes, I know this sounds ridiculous given how important the character will be down the line, but it's easy to forget that his character purpose in this story, his introduction, is to be part of this mystery. It's played in other ways with other characters. Chorley's disappearance after his ill-fated escape attempt, again, you just don't know, because it's suspicious we haven't seen him, but he's almost too much of an odious toad to be an effective double agent. The idea that he's just hiding somewhere trying not to wet himself, and probably failing, is entirely plausible. It's really effective at pulling the wool back and forth over our eyes, particularly with the introduction of the intelligence possession of Travers, which brings the possibility that the traitor might not even be a willing one. In the end, the reveal that I'll leave a pause in case for some reason you're watching this review before you've watched the actual story. There, you've been warned. The reveal that it was Staff Arnold the whole time is a genuine surprise, but it's not arsepull either, because of the character's gruff everyman persona and the grey area surrounding his death in the tunnels earlier, we accepted his return, and that turned out to have been a lie as a shock, but the numbers do connect together in our head, particularly as the question is open as to how long this has been the case. Was he always like this from the moment we saw him? I think this mystery plot drives the story very effectively and is a success. The story's success is also built on atmosphere and tension. The choice of the underground as a setting was perfect in putting up both. This tight, constrained space is also dark and isolated, gives the perfect gut feeling that everything is out of control of our heroes. That spiralling feeling is really helped by the setting and of course the plot progression, as everything does just go wrong all the time. That feeling of helplessness and dread is easily the most effective part of the atmosphere, combined of course with a sense of foreboding as a seemingly unstoppable Yeti comes into conflict with the soldiers and wipe the floor with them on every occasion. It also does a great job of using this ever-deteriorating situation to increase the tension, with the setting again used to great effect, allowing the tube channels to be the means of funneling this deadly fungus towards them. This is shown a few times using the special effects, but frankly the most effective bit is using that tube map in HQ to show it closing in on them, an effective way of taking the familiar element to the viewer and turning it into a means of creating that dread and tension. This is also assisted by the story structure. I think the pacing, for instance, is excellent. It by necessity is quite slow to allow the events and interactions to drive the story at what should be a realistic pace, but never slows down to become boring, by virtue of the fact there's always something happening, always a thread to be explored. Related to this is the structure does something I always appreciate. It keeps things fresh as it goes along, asking questions, answering them, and then asking new ones. It means there's never a point where things grind to a halt, with the exception of Where's the Doctor Gone in episode 2. Things otherwise always keep moving even if there's actually not a lot going on. For instance, most of episode 6 is simply all the characters moving from where they are at the start of the episode to the big final confrontation. But again, it does it in a way that keeps things fresh, new interactions, revelations, mysteries unanswered. It takes something otherwise quite pedestrian and boring and turns it into something that stays interesting. So we're all doing well so far, but I think the biggest strength of the story is in its characters, and how they add just enough humanity to it. The greatest strength of the classic series was how at its best it could inject real personality and humanity into even the most minor of its supporting characters, and this story is a shining example of that. A perfect demonstration of this is a small scene in episode 2 when Blake and Weems, two minor soldiers who anyone with a brain can tell needs to get their last will and testament sorted in a hurry, nevertheless have a small conversation while sitting in HQ where they just shoot the shit about their situation, the absurdity of it to them, and a scene that maybe gives a small bit of exposition, but mostly as the scene makes these two extremely minor characters just seem like people. Like real people stuck in this situation and who do matter, even if they'll shortly be on the Doctor Who list of remembrance as so many supporting characters do end up. And again, it doesn't need to go into their lifestyles or backstories or anything like that. You don't need to go, oh, I'm into X or motivated by Y, always exposited like that. It just lets two people have a normal conversation. I'll avoid skewing New Who for its total and complete inability to do this, whoops, too late, but I'll even say other parts of the classic series miss this trick. Too often in the Pertwee era, Unit's troop contingent feels like Yates, Benton and a bunch of extras, in a way that just completely lacks this kind of spark. As for the more important supporting characters, there are a great bunch. Staff Arnold, as I said earlier, the gruff everyman, eminently likeable and relatable, and it's easy to see why he's such a respected figure among the men. Captain Knight equally is a small but likeable role, competent soldier thrown into a situation beyond his means, and is doing his very best to keep everything together, and the pointlessness of his death only serves to further the feeling of dread and hopelessness that pervades the entire affair. Again, he feels less like a plot point and more like a person, with the subtleties in the script and performances that show him patience, reverence, etc. Evans is of course one of the most egregious crimes against the people of Wales there's ever been, and one can presume the making of New Who in Cardiff has been a 20-year apology for this story in particular, but I think even the most ardent Plaid Cymru supporter would have to admit a chuckle or two at his cartoon cowardice, which provides some much-needed comic relief throughout, while also being very much in the spirit of the piece. Everyone is coping in their own way, and his is just more brazen than anyone else's. Again, he's not just a plot point coming together, he's a character with dimensions. Pure cowardice and self-interest, of course, but those are dimensions nonetheless. Chorley is our designated arsehole for the time, and writing characters who are meant to be insufferable is a fine art, and one that Haisman and Lin could pull off very well. He's an odious prick who gets up everyone's noses immediately, but again this is through making him a human being rather than just doing what the script wants. He's a self-interested journalist for his own advancement and safety and nothing else. It's despicable, but it's also understandable. As someone who vastly overinflated their own sense of importance and ability to cope with this finds himself in a situation where death seems inevitable, well, them thinking damn well anyone else thinks I'm going to save myself, it does seem plausible, doesn't it? That he disappears from the story halfway through until the end helps the mystery plot, but also means he doesn't become too grating either. If he was just constantly there picking at everyone, he would start to get really annoying, but we just get exactly the right amount of it before we start focusing on others as well. So yeah, I think that's how you do an intentionally insufferable character right. Professor Travers is of course a return from the Abominable Snowman, only now in old age makeup that does make him look a bit silly, it has to be said. Apparently the first time Deborah Watling saw her father in the makeup she couldn't help burst out laughing, which, yeah. But that can be ignored as the character is put to excellent use here, as a link back to the first story of course, but also as an important character to look at in his own right. More mature and yet even more grumpy and irritable, my great regret is that they didn't do a spin-off, Professor Travers Yells at People. It would have run for seasons and seasons.
Professor Travers is here, sir.
What the devil's going on? Why have I been brought here like this? Who are you?
Knight.
Never heard of you. Who?
Captain Knight.
He doesn't need to be convinced of the Doctor's intentions, of course, and it's great to see the respect he treats the Doctor and his companions with. Seeing them not aged at all after 40 years tends to convince you of stuff like that, eh? But the best thing about him is that he's another human presence. It's his curiosity and tinkering with the control sphere that sets this in motion, and he obviously harbours a great deal of guilt about that as you'd expect him to. And it's his ability to hide that, try and move past it despite how much it's gnawing at him, is brilliantly put together in having this character as a flawed person. The yelling at everyone shows that, but he's someone in the end we root for, doing his best to right his wrong. It's a brilliant performance from Jack Watling which rounds it off. His yelling is second to none throughout Doctor Who's history, let me tell you. His daughter Anne is, I think, one of the 60s Who's great female characters, actually. I really love that she's portrayed as a scientist, first and foremost. She is the Doctor's helper throughout, of course, but in any human scientist would be, and I do really like that the Doctor shows respect and reverence for her skills, which she demonstrates admirably. And I think he holds her up as a scientist first, and they do make an effective double act as well. She's both an effective straight woman to his more comedic elements, and as an effective moral anchor as well. I think you can clearly see the genesis of Liz Shaw in this character.
What's a girl like you doing in a job like this?
Well, when I was a little girl, I thought I'd like to be a scientist, so I became a scientist.
Just like that?
Just like that.
And yeah, I think that's something Liz may well even have pretty much said at one point, or at least came very close to. Overall, I haven't got much to say other than that Anne is a strong, well-rounded character, motivated by her commitment to science and to duty and protecting herself and the people she cares about, such as her father. Tina Packard does a great job of making her to give her all these likeable qualities, and she sadly died earlier this year, which leaves Frazer Hines as the only surviving major cast member from the story, which is a bit sobering as we realise how long ago all this now was, and how it won't be long at all until it slips out of living memory. That cheery thought aside, we turn to the last supporting character, and obviously by far and away the most important, Colonel Lethbridge Stewart. He, in this story alone, is, as I said earlier, a red herring in the whodunit, but he makes an effective character in his own right. The elements of the character will become so familiar here. He comes to the story with an air of arrogance and bluntness that the Brigadier will become known for. He is acting as a single-minded soldier in many ways. But he's also proactive and decisive. He quickly takes charge and shows the situation is not beyond his abilities or leadership. There's a great scene in episode 4 where the TARDIS is explained to him, and he immediately believes it without hesitation. A double whammy character-wise as it contrasts with Chorley, who also believed it instantly, but in his case I was out of desperation for a way out, while the Colonel is thinking strategically about it, while demonstrating he is capable of critical thinking. After all, with her killer mists and robot Yeti, a police box that can travel in time doesn't sound that out of question, does it? These qualities are there to make him seem just as rounded and human as everyone else. He might be a bit arrogant, but he's a born leader and a quick, intelligent, decisive thinker. We see the qualities that elevated him. And while his gambit was a disastrous failure, it was only because he was betrayed, so we don't lose that sense from him as he returns from Covent Garden in shock. Courtney, of course, plays the role with subtlety and gravitas. He immediately makes his presence known, and while it's difficult not to see that all of that, his performance included, in the context in the next 43 years of his appearances throughout Doctor Who. But as much as the character's introduction here shows those elements of their earlier stage, it works in an effective way of making him an interesting character even just this one time. In a way, taking a character that could have been the one-note military leader, who in countless mediocre stories in both classic and new exists just to butt heads with the Doctor and all that, provides so many interesting character interactions and character beats instead. It's easy to see why they brought the character back and set Lethbridge Stewart and Courtney on their journey to immortality. As for the regulars, Jamie and Victoria, I think both have a good story. Jamie is at his most proactive here, helping out the soldiers and thrusting himself into the action as only Jamie can. Scotland very much beats Wales when he's teamed up with Evans, it's fair to say. He's still about at the time, of course, but his intelligence, guile and adaptability are all on show as the situation fails to daunt him. I also like that the Doctor's implicit trust of him is a major part of episode 6 coming together, and I think it shows the strength of their relationship and why it was so successful. That and of course the chemistry between Troughton and Hines, which is always on show. Victoria, of course, is always going to be a lot less proactive, and her just blurting out about the TARDIS to Chorley is not one of her finer moments, but she makes up for it in a few ways, most notably when she's being captured by the Control Travers, using the cover of hysterical crying to drop things for Jamie to follow. It's a wheeze she shows off a few times throughout her time on the show, using the cover of what everyone expects of her to be more proactive than you might think. And as for the Doctor, well, I'd say this is vintage Second Doctor. It's entirely what you'd expect, of course. It wouldn't be fair to say this breaks any new ground, but it's his characterization at his best. Happy to play the clown when it suits him, and this of course brings him light relief, pretty much the only instances not involving a cowardly Welshman throughout the whole story, and that's always welcome, but he's deadly serious when it comes to the important matters. He's sharp, quick-witted, but what I like most of all, he really is one step ahead of everyone, including the intelligence all the time. When the intelligence is given the ultimatum, the Doctor says he will give himself up if he has to, but you just know he's already going round in his head how to avoid it, and that all his tinkering throughout the story comes together when he uses little inventions in order to sabotage the helmet. It's that feeling that he really is the smartest person in the room, which is always his Doctor's most important trait. The silly man happy to tootle on the recorder is also able to defeat the intelligence of the Paradise London, which is the contents of his arse and his wits. Troughton is of course wonderful, which doesn't leave you much else to say. This is the Second Doctor at his finest. Finally, I'll quickly talk about the villains of the piece. The Yeti have had a bit of a redesign, which I can't say I love, as the slightly triangle-shaped head does sort of rob them as the faceless menace they had in the first story, but their hugely imposing physical presence more than makes up for that. Helped by being expertly shot by Camfield, really sells them as the enforcers of the intelligence, and their absolute slaughter of the troops of Covent Garden makes them seem as powerful as any enemy the Doctor has ever faced. Rarely in the unit days would an enemy just cut through them like butter like this. It really hammers home how much of a menace this is. As I said, the intelligence has a bit of a dodgy plan, but it's made up for it by its presentation. It goes for something a bit different from the first story. Instead of just one ghostly voice, it has many voices, depending on who it's possessing, which really adds the idea of this as a nebulous floating consciousness. His ability to hijack the TARDIS in a way nobody else really would until the Time Lord showed up at the end of the Black and White era is another way of demonstrating its power and menace. I'd like it if, once again, its plan made any real sense, but the intelligence just showed itself to be a serious threat, and one which the audience takes seriously. Which probably leaves me to round up, but I will add on one more thing quickly. This story is where the unit dating controversy originated. As Travis says, it's been 40 years since the Abominable Snowman, which was reported to be in 1935, which means this takes place in the 70s and therefore dates the Third Doctor's era to the late 70s and early 80s. Except, of course, when it's stated in the series multiple times have been taking place around the time of the broadcast of the stories involved. It's a mess that I think is a great example of Doctor Who's charm, but its continuity can just make absolutely no sense and everyone just sort of shrugs. Unlike something like Star Wars, where if Glup Shitto is the wrong colour shoes, all the fans crap themselves, but I'd like to volunteer to make the situation even worse. There's another element of this story that adds even more issues. See, the tube map in the HQ doesn't have the Victoria line on it, which dates the story to early 1968 at the very latest, which is around the time of the broadcast of the story, and in fact the first stage of the line opened only about 6 months later. Certainly it means it can't have taken place as late as 1975, so either I've just made the dating controversy even worse by muddling it even more, or I've just fixed it, by definitively fixating the story in the late 60s, meaning the invasion and consequently the Third Doctor's era takes place in the early 70s, and you just write off Travers as rounding up to 40 years or something like that. You're welcome, everyone. So I do love this story, as a mysterious, atmospheric, tense, smart, character-led piece. It's not flawless by any stretch of the imagination. I have to imagine anyone who hyped it up as flawless in themselves when it was missing may have had that twinge of disappointment as it was just merely great. But again, that was a bit of a second time as fast situation as I laid out. Nevertheless, this is a great story, and I think we're so much richer for having it back in the archives. It's a prime example of how much is lost with a story being missing. We now have the atmosphere, the subtleties of Troughton's performance, the strength of Camfield's direction, the power of the Yeti, all the things you otherwise would have been without, and I think now we can do nothing else but sit there and appreciate how all these elements come together and be grateful we have them back in the archive. Yes, we're an episode down on what we would have had if Morris hadn't been a total boob, but hey, he got us the rest of it, and that we do need to be eternally grateful for, even if he has shown himself to be a bit of a brat. I'll just move on to the final score now, which I'm giving as 8 out of 10. It's a fine piece, tense, atmospheric and well-paced, with excellent characters and a fantastic mystery. It uses its setting wonderfully and creates just a really fun bit of action and entertainment. Okay, the plot is a bit crap sometimes, but you can look past it because everything else works so well. I really love this story and I think it's top quality 62.